They walked into my daughter's new home like they owned it, claimed the master bedroom, lit cigarettes on custom furniture, and told us we were the guests. I thought I was giving my child a fresh start, but instead, I nearly handed her over to a family that saw her as nothing more than a free housekeeper. What I did next shocked everyone, but that was only the beginning of what unraveled next. They say weddings are a time of joy, of union, of new beginnings, but nothing could have prepared me for the betrayal that came not from a stranger, but from the very family my daughter was about to marry into. I had gifted her a house, a home of love and safety, as a wedding present. But before the ceremony even took place, they barged in like they owned the place. Not with gratitude, but with greed. The moment I heard Miss S. Miller's shrill voice echoing through the house, I knew something was wrong. Thomas, my husband, had poured his heart and hundreds of thousands of dollars into renovating this home for Natalie, our only daughter. He had selected every detail: the oak floors, the crown molding, the custom-built kitchen island. And yet, this woman, this stranger, dared to ridicule it before even stepping through the door. "Oh, Curtis," she bellowed, "this community feels like a prison. No one even opens their doors. That gate outside, it looks like a dam. What are we, protecting a bank?" She laughed bitterly. "Should our relatives be treated like beggars just to come visit?" Her words grated against my nerves. I stood frozen on the doorstep, barely able to contain myself. This wasn't her home. This wasn't her gift. This was the place we gave Natalie, the daughter we had raised with everything we had. And this woman had the audacity to critique it, as if she were evaluating a used motel. Curtis, her son and Natalie's fiancé, stood beside her with hunched shoulders and a sheepish expression. He said nothing, not a word. He didn't correct her. He didn't defend us. He didn't even blink. As Thomas and I stepped into the house, we were greeted not by warmth or thanks, but by Mr. Miller sprawled out on the master bed, his dirty sneakers still on, leaving stains on the pristine sheets. His wife was sitting on the edge of the bed, legs crossed, shoes up, acting as though the house was already theirs. Then came the final insult. Mr. Miller stubbed his cigarette out on the nightstand. My nightstand, the one we had paid for. Thomas's jaw clenched so tightly, I worried he'd crack a molar. Natalie, always trying to stay composed, froze like a statue between her future in-laws and her own parents. She looked helpless, caught between the people she loved and the people she was supposed to join through marriage. "Oh, this room is perfect," Mr. Miller sighed. "We'll take it." Just like that. No asking, no discussion, no respect. They had simply claimed it. I felt the blood drain from my face. I stared at them, trying to comprehend the sheer gall. But it wasn't over. Not even close. Mr. Miller waltzed into another bedroom, smaller, less sunlit, and nodded approvingly. "Travis and Jenna can take this one. Curtis, call your brother and tell him to cancel his lease. And we'll put the house in Travis's name for stability. You and Natalie can come back after you have kids. No rush." My heart dropped. They were dividing our daughter's home, her sanctuary, like it was a motel. Assigning rooms, making plans, taking what wasn't theirs. And Curtis, standing there with his head down, said nothing. Natalie's eyes welled up, not with tears, but with the kind of silent fury I had only seen once before when she was 10, and a teacher had unfairly accused her of cheating on a test. "This is not your house," Natalie said, her voice steady but cold. "It was a gift from my parents. You have no right to dictate who lives here." But Mrs. Miller, ever the manipulator, just waved her hand. "Sweetheart, don't be so selfish. Travis is paying rent elsewhere. Why let space go to waste? And you don't even have kids yet. What do you need the big room for? Luca's going to need space to grow." I felt my fists clench at my sides. These people weren't just entitled, they were delusional. They believed our generosity entitled them to ownership. And then the dagger came. Mrs. Miller turned to Natalie with a smug smile. "As our daughter-in-law, it's only right you take care of us. Cooking, cleaning, making sure we're comfortable. After all, family means supporting one another. Natalie's hands trembled. Her jaw tightened. "You're not family," she said softly. "You're just greedy." Miss S. Miller's expression darkened. "Is that how you talk to your future mother-in-law? You should be grateful we're willing to share this space with you." Curtis finally opened his mouth. "Natalie, come on, don't be like this. You're making a scene." "No," she snapped. "I'm setting boundaries. This is my house. My parents gifted it to me. And if you really believe this is your family's home, you can leave. All of you." Thomas's hand found mine. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes was enough. He was done playing nice. So was I. But it wasn't over. Miss S. Miller, face red and trembling, turned to Curtis. "She's disrespecting us. And you're just going to stand there?" Curtis took a shaky breath. "Natalie, apologize to my parents." The room went still. Natalie stared at him as though seeing him for the first time. "Apologize?" she repeated. "For protecting myself? For not letting them take what doesn't belong to them?" I could feel the air crackling with tension. Then, slowly, she pulled her arm from Curtis's grasp. "If you think I should apologize, then maybe you're not the man I thought you were." And then, she turned to us, her parents. "I'm not marrying him." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't impulsive. It was a calm, clear decision made by a woman who had finally seen the truth. Miss S. Miller scoffed. "My son would never take you back now. You think you're better than us? You'll regret this." Thomas stepped forward, calm but firm. "No, the only thing to regret here is that we ever let you in." But that wasn't the end. What Curtis did next made everything worse. "What would you do if your child's future in-laws tried to take over your home? Let me know below." I had never seen Thomas so livid. As Mr. Miller stood there, puffing on his cigarette like he was some kind of king surveying his new castle, my husband's hands clenched into fists. The room still carried the scent of fresh paint. The walls gleamed with newly installed light fixtures, and the polished hardwood floor glistened under the overhead lights. This was supposed to be our daughter's new beginning, a home where love would grow, where she'd plant roots and build a life with her new husband. But within a few short hours, that dream had begun to rot. Curtis's silence was perhaps the most deafening sound of all. The man who once wooed our daughter with charm and promises now stood like a limp shadow behind his parents, too cowardly to step forward, too small to speak. Natalie, God bless her, had kept her composure longer than anyone expected, but even she had her limits. She had grown up watching her father fight for what mattered. She knew what it meant to protect what you'd built with your own hands. And now, someone else was trying to steal it. The Millers were relentless. Not only had they claimed the master bedroom, but they started making plans as if the entire house belonged to them. Mr. Miller, in his ever-entitled tone, said that Travis, Curtis's younger brother, would be moving in with his wife Jenna and their son Luca. He had it all figured out: who would sleep where, who would take over which space, and even what kind of future Natalie and Curtis should have. The audacity left me speechless. As if Natalie's life was just a guest room in their grand family plan. Natalie tried to remain respectful. "This house was a gift from my parents," she said, trying to keep her voice level. "It wasn't meant to be shared with the entire Miller family." Miss S. Miller's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sweetie, marriage means sharing. If you don't want to share a home, what else won't you share?" I nearly stepped forward then, but Thomas held me back with a hand on my arm. He knew, as I did, that this was Natalie's fight to start. But the moment Curtis opened his mouth not to defend Natalie, but to ask her to show a little grace toward his parents, I saw the fire leave my daughter's eyes. The heartbreak was instant. She wasn't just disappointed, she was shattered. She turned slowly, locking eyes with him. "Do you even see what's happening? Your parents are disrespecting my family, and you're asking me to be gracious?" Curtis stammered, trying to explain. "It's just for a little while. My parents are only trying to help." "They're good people," Thomas scoffed under his breath. "Good people don't invite themselves into a house they didn't pay for and then try to take it over." "Mr. Miller interrupted, his voice mocking and smug. "Help? Oh, we're doing her a favor. Look at her, she's nearing 30, still unmarried until now, probably desperate. My son could have done better, you know, but we accepted her. That did it. Thomas stepped forward, not with violence, but with presence. You don't get to speak about my daughter like that. You may not value her, but we do. And everything in this house, from the floorboards to the chandeliers, was paid for with love, not entitlement. You are not welcome here. Curtis looked stunned, like he had finally woken up, but didn't know what to do next. Natalie was already walking toward the front door. "I'm done," she said. "This wedding is off," Mrs. Miller gasped. "You're not serious." "Oh, I'm deadly serious." Natalie turned back once, her voice calm but cold. "This isn't a marriage. It's a merger, and I never signed up to be a part of your family business." And with that, she stepped outside. I followed her, grabbing my purse as I passed. Thomas stayed behind for a moment, standing squarely between the Millers and the rest of the house, like a sentry guarding a sacred space. As we got into the car, Natalie broke down, not in loud sobs, but in quiet, gut-wrenching tears that soaked her blouse. She had believed in love. She had believed in Curtis. But all along, he had believed in obedience to his parents, to their traditions, to their control. Back at our home, we didn't say much. Thomas poured 3 glasses of wine, and we sat in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Natalie eventually spoke. "I think I knew," she whispered. "I think I knew they were like this, but I kept hoping Curtis would stand up for me." "He didn't," Thomas said simply. "And that's all you need to know." Later that night, Natalie showed me a message on her phone. It was from Curtis. A long, rambling apology, full of excuses, full of regret, but not once did he say, "I should have protected you." The next day, things took a darker turn. A delivery truck arrived at our house. Inside, a man handed Natalie a package, a manila envelope with her name scrawled in thick ink. Inside was a spreadsheet. Line after line, itemized charges. Dinners, coffee dates, Uber rides, even Valentine's Day roses, all tallied up with precision. At the bottom, a final figure .2, $897.36. And beneath that, a note in Curtis's handwriting, "You owe me this." Fair is fair. Natalie stared at the paper, speechless. Thomas took it, read it, then crumpled it up. "Entitled little bastard," he muttered. Natalie wasn't angry. Not exactly. She was numb. "He really thought this was a transaction," she said softly. And that was the moment she stopped grieving. That was the moment she started fighting back. I had thought Natalie's declaration calling off the wedding and cutting ties with Curtis would be the end of it. But I was wrong. That family didn't walk away with their tails between their legs. If anything, they doubled down. That evening, the house was unusually quiet. Thomas was out back, sanding down a bench that had lost its varnish, and I was folding laundry when I heard the front door open. Natalie stepped in, looking exhausted, her shoulders sagging under the weight of something invisible but heavy. She didn't say a word, just handed me her phone and walked toward the kitchen. On the screen was an email subject line, a fair request. It was from Curtis. I'll admit, for a moment, I braced myself. Maybe he was reaching out to apologize, though it would have been too little, too late. But as I read on, my jaw clenched. In the body of the email, Curtis had attached a spreadsheet, an actual spreadsheet. Every dollar he had invested in Natalie during their relationship was logged: Starbucks coffees, Uber rides, Valentine's Day roses, meals they'd shared, even a $14 birthday gift card. It was itemized, line by line, complete with dates and totals. At the bottom, bolded and underlined, was the total to $897.36. Then came the kicker. "Just send me this amount and we'll consider things even." Even? Thomas came in, wiping his hands on a rag. I showed him the phone. His eyes narrowed. "Is this a joke?" I shook my head. "He's serious. He's billing her for their relationship." Thomas let out a low whistle and muttered, "The audacity of that boy." Curtis hadn't just sent the invoice. He added a closing line that made my blood boil. "If you don't pay, I'll have to explain this to your employer." I'm sure Granite Group wouldn't want someone with financial disputes on their team. He was threatening her job now. That evening, we gathered at the dining table. Natalie sat between us, her head in her hands. Thomas and I were quiet, letting her speak first. "Do I pay him?" she asked softly. "No," Thomas said immediately, but I raised a hand. "We'll give him exactly what he asked for," I said, "but not for the reason he thinks." So the next day, I wrote a check for $3,000, generous to the cent. We sent it via certified mail. The check was signed, sealed, and delivered. Let that be the end of it, except it wasn't. Just 2 days later, Natalie received another surprise, an unmarked envelope delivered to her office. Inside was a printed version of the same spreadsheet and a copy of the check defaced with the word "payment received" finally scribbled in red ink. Attached was a sticky note. "Tell your friends how grateful you are." He wanted to humiliate her, and he wasn't done yet. That week, his parents showed up again, but not at our home. No, they went to Natalie's workplace. They waited in the lobby, loudly demanding to speak to someone in charge. Mrs. Miller shouted that Natalie owed their son money. She waved the spreadsheet around like it was evidence in a courtroom. People gathered. Phones came out. Staff stood back, unsure what to do. Natalie had been in a meeting, unaware of the chaos unfolding below, until a colleague came running to get her. When we arrived, Thomas and I both rushed there upon her call. The lobby was packed. Mrs. Miller was standing atop a decorative ledge, waving the poster-sized printout of the invoice like a protest sign. Mr. Miller had an entire folder full of evidence, and Curtis was in the corner, hunched and silent, looking like he wished he could disappear. The room went silent when Natalie stepped in. "There she is!" Mrs. Miller shouted. "The scammer!" Before Natalie could speak, I stepped forward. My voice didn't need to be loud, it was firm and clear. "Since you've made this a public matter," I said, "let's discuss it like adults." The crowd shifted, some people whispering, others recording. I turned to Mrs. Miller. "How much did she owe again?" $2,800, she began. $2,897.36, I interrupted, holding up a copy of the check. "We paid it, in full, with change." Then I paused, let the silence hang. "Now let's talk about what your son owes her." I pulled out a second folder. Receipts, photos, digital proof, all the times Natalie paid for dinner, covered holidays, bought gifts, helped during Curtis's father's hospital stay. The crowd grew quiet, then gasped. Mr. Miller's face turned white. Curtis looked like he was about to faint. I read aloud, a $1,200 siphon for Curtis's birthday, a $1,500 hospital fund for his father, multiple dinners, Uber rides, home supplies. "Shall I continue?" Mrs. Miller sputtered. That's not the same." "No?" I raised an eyebrow. "Because it sounds like your son accepted gifts and support, and now he's trying to shame her for it." I turned to the crowd. "If someone tried to humiliate your daughter in front of her colleagues for buying coffee and flowers, how would you respond?" Murmurs of support grew louder. Someone even clapped. Mrs. Miller's voice cracked. "This isn't over." "Oh, it is," Natalie said, stepping forward. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "If you so much as approach my workplace again, we'll have you arrested for harassment." Curtis finally looked up. "I didn't mean for this to get so big." "No," Natalie replied. "You meant to humiliate me. That was the plan all along. But you forgot who I am." That night, the office buzzed with what had happened. Employees defended Natalie, her boss called to commend her composure, and even security applauded our family for standing firm. But as we all know, humiliation doesn't just disappear, it has consequences. Curtis was called in by his company's HR department the next day. And when they discovered the paper trail he'd left, the spreadsheet, the threatening emails, the public spectacle, he was let go. No dramatic showdown, just a quiet termination. By then, though, Curtis had already lost more than a job. He had lost every ounce of respect Natalie ever had for him. He had become a cautionary tale in the office halls. He had become a shadow of the man he pretended to be. And still, it wasn't the end, because a week later, Natalie got a text from an unknown number. It read, "Please, let's talk. I made a mistake. What would you do if your ex tried to crawl back after all that? Would you answer or stay silent? Let us know your thoughts. Should Natalie respond or block him for good?" The moment Natalie pulled her arm away from Curtis's grasp, everything shifted. She was no longer trying to maintain peace. Her voice, clear, unshaken, cut through the thick tension like a blade. "You don't get to talk about dignity when your family just tried to hijack our lives," she said, her eyes blazing. Curtis's face fell. He looked small next to her now, like a child being scolded. Miss S. Miller, however, wasn't ready to back down. Her lips curled into a sneer as she stepped forward again. "You'll regret this, Natalie. Women like you end up bitter and alone. Curtis was your chance, your only chance." Before anyone could react, Natalie smiled calm, fearless. "Then I'd rather be alone," she said softly, "than tied to a family like yours." I watched her, my heart swelling. For so long, she'd tried to appease them, to play the good fiancé, to smooth over every rough edge with grace. But that moment, watching her take a stand, was more beautiful than any wedding day could have been. The Millers stormed out that afternoon. Curtis lingered the longest, his eyes pleading. But Natalie didn't flinch. She simply turned her back, and that was the end of it. Or so we thought. That evening, Natalie came home, her face tight with unease. She sat down, pulling her phone from her bag without a word, and handed it to me. "Read this," she said, her voice strained. It was an email from Curtis. Subject, reimbursement. His words were unbelievable. He had attached a spreadsheet titled, "What Natalie Owes Me." There it was, line by line, a breakdown of every dollar he had ever spent during their relationship. Coffee, movie tickets, Uber rides, even gum. At the bottom, $897.36. "I'll be generous," the email read. "Just send me this and we'll call it even." I stared at the screen in disbelief, then looked up at Natalie. She gave a tired, bitter laugh. "You know what the worst part is?" she said. "He really thinks I owe him." Thomas nearly choked on his drink when he saw the file. "He listed the espresso he bought you? Twice?" But Natalie wasn't laughing. "He said, if I don't pay, he'll contact my employer, accuse me of financial manipulation." That crossed a line. The next day, we met with our family lawyer. He assured us that Curtis had no legal ground to demand repayment for consensual relationship expenses. Still, we didn't want this lingering. Natalie made a decision. She wired him exactly $897.36. "He'll never say I owe him again," she told me, her jaw set. We thought that would be the end. We were wrong again. 2 days later, we arrived at Natalie's office and were greeted by chaos. People were whispering, staring. As we approached the elevator, we saw them, Curtis and his parents, in the lobby. Mrs. Miller's voice rang out. "Where is your supervisor? My son was used, manipulated, and now she refuses to pay." Natalie froze. "They dated for a year," Mrs. Miller continued, waving her arms, like a woman auditioning for a courtroom drama. "She bled him dry, and now she's pretending it never happened." Curtis looked pale, miserable, but he didn't stop her. When Natalie stepped forward, the entire room fell silent. "That's not true," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Mrs. Miller whipped around. "You think your little check fixes this? You embarrassed our family. We deserve compensation." Thomas stepped between them. "She paid. That's more than your son ever did. Now leave." But Mrs. Miller wasn't finished. She pulled out a poster board, yes, a literal poster board with printed receipts and photos of small gifts Curtis had given over the year. The crowd gasped, then slowly started to laugh. "You made a billboard of $3 coffee receipts?" someone muttered. Even Curtis looked humiliated now. Then Natalie did something that silenced the room. She stepped forward and said calmly, "Fine. You want to do this publicly? Let's talk about all the money I spent." She took out her phone and pulled up her bank app, iPhone $1,200. "Hospital bill for your father, $1,500. Dinner, movies, gifts, you name it." Curtis turned white, And I never asked for a dime back, she said. Because that's what grown-ups do when they care about someone. There, it was dignity, power, and heartbreak. We walked away without saying another word. That day, Curtis lost more than his pride. He lost whatever chance he had of coming back. But he wasn't finished yet. The following week, Natalie received a package at home. Inside was a letter handwritten, pages long. It wasn't an apology. It was a guilt trip. Memories, compliments, pleas for one more chance. And one final line, if you don't come back, I don't know what I'll do. It was no longer about love. It was emotional blackmail. Natalie sat on the couch, the letter trembling in her hands. I'm done, she whispered. I need to make sure he can't reach me again. That afternoon, we filed for a restraining order. And this time, we weren't scared of what he might say. We were ready. Because this wasn't just a breakup anymore. It was war. And my daughter? She was finally learning to fight back. I wish I could tell you things quieted down after that explosive confrontation in the office lobby. But of course, they didn't. Curtis and his family vanished in embarrassment after I publicly handed him a check and then turned the tables by calculating everything he owed Natalie. We had hoped that final humiliation would end things, that they'd crawl away and lick their wounds in private. But people like the Millers, they don't go quietly, not when their pride is bruised and their entitlement challenged. It started with silence. A few days of eerie calm, like the eye of a storm. Natalie resumed her usual routine, waking up early, heading to work, coming home exhausted but relieved that the circus had packed up and left town. She didn't talk about Curtis, and we didn't bring him up. We thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally get the space to heal. Until one evening, when she walked through the door with an all-too-familiar slump in her shoulders and handed me her phone. Another email, she said flatly. It was from Curtis. This time, the subject line read, "Let's talk like adults." I already felt my blood pressure rising, the nerve. The message itself was dripping with guilt-laced language and artificial remorse. He said he regretted how things ended, that he let his emotions cloud his judgment, that Natalie meant more to him than she could imagine. And then, as if we didn't already see through his game, he added a new kind of threat. I've been thinking about how we can both find closure, he wrote. There are some things I could say about you, but I won't, unless I have no choice. It was veiled, subtle, but we understood the threat behind those words. He was dangling the idea of defaming her again, unless she responded. Does he think this will win me back? Natalie asked, voice tight. What is he even trying to accomplish? That's the thing about people like Curtis. They don't want closure. They want control. We blocked the email, saved a copy for our records, and forwarded it to our lawyer. We'd already begun the process of filing for a civil harassment restraining order, and this email only strengthened our case. But Curtis wasn't done. A few days later, a package showed up at our front door, no return address, no note. Inside was a handwritten letter. Natalie opened it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. And then she began to read aloud. It was nostalgic at first recollections of their early dates. The time she nursed his father through his health scare. The first time he said, I love you. But then the tone shifted. It became desperate, dark, almost obsessive. I can't imagine life without you, he wrote. I don't know what I'll do if I can't have you in it. There it was again. Not a message of love, a threat. Subtle, emotionally manipulative, and designed to weigh heavily on her conscience. I feel sick, Natalie whispered. He doesn't want to get back together. He wants to haunt me. That afternoon, we went to the courthouse. She sat on a bench, gripping the letter like it might explode. I know this is the right thing, she murmured. So why do I still feel so tired? Because healing takes energy, I told her gently. And people like him feed on it. We filed a request for a temporary restraining order that day. The court approved it without hesitation, based on the evidence we'd compiled. Emails, social media harassment, that public confrontation at her workplace, and now, the letter. Finally, Curtis was legally barred from contacting Natalie in any way. We thought maybe now finally he'd stop. And for a little while he did. Natalie started sleeping more soundly. Her smile returned. We went to the farmer's market together on weekends again. She even started attending yoga classes with a few old friends she'd lost touch with during the Curtis years. It felt like the nightmare had ended. But then came the social media attack. It started with a whisper, an anonymous post on a local gossip forum. A blurry photo of Natalie, taken from what looked like an office building security footage, paired with a venomous caption, "Gold digger milks rich boyfriend, dumps him after using his family, now flaunting her privilege like she earned it." The photo was old, the account anonymous, but we knew who was behind it: Curtis. We couldn't prove it immediately, but the language, the timing, the bitterness, it was unmistakable. Over the next few days, more posts followed on different platforms. A video surfaced showing Natalie at a networking event, edited just enough to make her seem arrogant. There were snide captions about how some women think their daddy's money entitles them to treat men like trash. It wasn't just malicious, it was strategic. He was trying to destroy her reputation professionally and personally. But this time, Natalie didn't crumble. She forwarded every post, every screenshot, every URL to our lawyer. She contacted the platforms. She gathered evidence, and then she looked at me and said, "Let's fight this the right way." I couldn't have been prouder. We filed a formal defamation report with our lawyer's firm, sent takedown requests to every platform, filed a subpoena request for the IP addresses linked to the anonymous accounts. We also began building a case for a permanent restraining order. Then, one morning, Natalie received a package. Inside was a photo album. At first, she thought it was junk, but when she opened it, she found printed screenshots of their old texts, photos from their vacations, and even a dried rose from one of their dates. And taped to the inside cover, a note in Curtis's handwriting: "You said we were forever. Don't make me remind you what that means." That was the final straw. We escalated the case immediately. Our attorneys submitted the entire record to the court. That very week, a judge granted Natalie a full 3-year restraining order. Curtis was officially out of her life by force of law. No contact, no proximity, no more games. The relief in her eyes when we left that courtroom was something I'll never forget. But the question still lingered. Why do some people only understand the meaning of no when it's printed on legal paper? The hallway buzzed with whispers and disapproving looks as Mrs. Miller held the check in her hand like a trophy. She waved it once, almost as if she wanted to show it to every person standing there, thinking she had somehow won. But victory was fleeting. I turned to her calmly and said, "Since we're settling scores, why don't we go over your debts too?" The color drained from her face. The crowd that had been ready to disperse now froze again, sensing the shift. This wasn't just about a breakup or petty money disputes. This was about truth and the weight of everything that had been overlooked for too long. Mrs. Miller tried to wave me off. "What debts? That's ridiculous." I didn't flinch. "The new iPhone for your son's birthday, $1,200. The $1,500 I gave when Mr. Miller was hospitalized. That's already $2,700. And I haven't even mentioned the countless other ways Natalie supported your son. Do you really want me to go on?" Curtis looked like he wanted to disappear. I reached into my bag and pulled out printed receipts. Here's the proof. Dated. Verified. Not emotional claims, just cold, hard numbers. Around us, the room began to shift again. The judgment that had initially pointed at Natalie now turned, inch by inch, toward the Millers. Natalie stepped forward. Her voice was calm but steely. "You want to talk about fairness? Let's bring your son's coworkers into this. Let's bring HR. Let's talk about what it means to weaponize shame in the workplace." Curtis flinched. His office was 2 floors up. "Let's go up there," Natalie continued. "Let's explain how you thought it was okay to publicly shame me at my workplace over a coffee bill." "Miss S." Miller gasped, then swung her hand upward toward Natalie's face. But I was ready. I stepped in between, locking eyes with her. "You better put that hand down," I said coldly. Curtis took a shaky step back. His mother was frozen. Her son looked like a child caught stealing candy. "Curtis," I said, turning to him, You've done nothing but humiliate yourself here today, and now you've lost your last shred of dignity." Instead of lashing out again, he simply nodded, quietly, broken. We walked out, leaving the building behind. But the Millers? They stayed, surrounded by a crowd that no longer believed them. Natalie and I didn't speak much on the way home. She was quiet, eyes watching the city blur past the window. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was the weight of years of patience unraveling all at once. That evening, as she sat at the dining table, her phone buzzed. Another message from Curtis. This time, it wasn't a demand. It was a plea. "I'm sorry. I let them influence me. I shouldn't have blamed you. You were always good to me." She read the message without reacting. Then she handed the phone to me. "Do you think he's really sorry?" she asked. "Or just sorry he lost?" I didn't have to answer. The silence between us was louder than words. 2 days later, a package arrived at our door. Inside, a handwritten letter. It was neatly folded, ink carefully penned, in what was clearly an attempt at nostalgia. It recounted their first dates, late-night conversations, the time she held his hand when his father was sick. At first, it felt almost sincere. Then came the twist. "If you leave me completely, I don't know what I'll do." Natalie held the letter tightly, her knuckles white. "This is manipulation," she whispered. I nodded. "We're going to the courthouse." That afternoon, we filed for a temporary restraining order. The process was surprisingly fast. Natalie presented the messages, the letter, and even the social media post he'd tried to hide behind an anonymous account. "This isn't heartbreak," our lawyer said. "It's control, and it ends now." The judge agreed. The order was granted. Curtis was legally barred from contacting her again. No calls, no emails, no social media messages. If he tried, there would be consequences. Later that evening, we sat on the porch together. The sky was streaked with soft pink and gold. Natalie leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. "Do you think healing ever stops feeling like war?" she asked softly. "No," I answered, "but one day, it stops feeling like you're losing." The next morning, Natalie woke up lighter. Her posture was straighter, her voice stronger. At work, she threw herself into new projects. She volunteered to lead a major presentation for Granite and Company at a national conference. And when the day came, she stood on stage, confident, poised, and utterly radiant. That's where she met Ethan Parker. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't overly charming. He just listened. Later that week, he sent her a handwritten thank you note for her speech. No pressure, no expectations, just a gesture of respect. It was the first time in months she smiled while reading something from a man. No more invoices, no more threats, just kindness. And somehow, that made all the difference. Have you ever known someone who changed the moment you stopped expecting them to? The days that followed should have brought peace, but instead, they dragged us deeper into Curtis's web of bitterness and immaturity. Natalie was finally free from the emotional chaos he and his family had brought into our lives. At least, that's what we thought. But just when we began to breathe again, Curtis reminded us he wasn't going to let go so easily. It started with the email, a painfully detailed spreadsheet of every dollar he claimed he had ever spent on Natalie during their relationship. Not gifts, not gestures, just expenses. It was as if he thought dating her had been some kind of investment portfolio. And now, with the breakup finalized, he wanted his returns. $4.25 for a coffee, $11.8 for roses, $14 for a movie ticket. Page after page of petty transactions, ending with the line, total $897.36. Be generous and round it up. I expect payment by Friday. I couldn't believe my eyes. This man, who never once paid for a real date, who accepted the house and ring without shame, was now billing my daughter like she was a business deal gone wrong. Thomas stared at the screen in disbelief, muttering, "You've got to be kidding me." Natalie's face was tight with frustration, but she didn't cry this time. She simply said, "He's not done trying to control the narrative. That's all this is." Still, Curtis wasn't content with email threats. Within days, he He and his parents showed up this time at Natalie's workplace. Yes, you heard that right. The same man who itemized coffee costs was now outside her office building with his mother, shouting about being swindled. They were waving around that ridiculous spreadsheet like it was a legal document. Mrs. Miller even had the audacity to demand to speak to her supervisor. "She took advantage of my son," she cried out in the lobby, loud enough for coworkers and passersby to hear. She used him, drained him financially, and now she's refusing to pay him back. Natalie and I had just stepped out of the elevator when we heard the shouting. She froze. Her coworker's eyes widened in confusion and disbelief. The embarrassment on her face broke my heart. I stepped in immediately, blocking Mrs. Miller's path. "Let's get one thing clear," I said, my voice calm but cold. "Exactly how much does your son claim he's owed?" Mrs. Miller, standing proudly like she was about to deliver a courtroom verdict, barked, $2,897.36. There was a moment of silence. Then, a burst of laughter from someone in the crowd. That laughter spread like wildfire. Whispers turned into giggles. A young man in a suit leaned over and asked, "Wait, they're here over Starbucks and movie tickets?" Another muttered, "This feels like a prank." But Mrs. Miller wasn't done. She pulled out a poster board, yes, a literal poster board covered in taped receipts and handwritten annotations. "This is every dime he spent on her," she bellowed. Curtis just stood off to the side, shrinking into himself. At that moment, I reached into my purse, pulled out my checkbook, and calmly wrote a check for $3. "Oh, here," I said, tossing it at Curtis's feet. "Now we're even, paid in full." Mrs. Miller lunged for it like she'd just won the lottery. But before she could gloat, I continued, "And now, let's talk about what you owe us." Their faces went pale. I turned to the gathering crowd and lifted my phone. "Let's do a quick tally. $1,200 phone for his birthday. $1,500 medical help for his father. Countless dinners and rides. I've got receipts too." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Curtis's mouth opened, then closed. Mrs. Miller looked like she wanted to vanish. Natalie, her voice steady now, stepped forward. "If you don't stop, we'll take this to court. And if that's not enough, maybe Curtis's employer should know how their employee behaves in public." Mrs. Miller's face crumpled as she realized we weren't bluffing. But before she could retreat, she raised her hand toward Natalie, ready to strike. I stepped between them. "Try it," I warned. Everyone saw it. Everyone knew. This wasn't a family asking for justice. This was a spectacle, built on entitlement and delusion. Later that afternoon, we met with Curtis's supervisor, who had seen the video footage from the lobby and read the ridiculous email himself. As soon as he learned who I was, Natalie's mother, yes, but also a senior advisor at Granite and Company, his expression changed. "This is completely unacceptable," he said, shaking his head. "We'll be handling this internally." Curtis was issued a formal reprimand and warned that further incidents would lead to termination. He left the building with his head down. We thought it was over, but the next morning, Natalie received an anonymous social media message from a fake account. It included a heavily edited video and a caption that read, "Beware of gold diggers in corporate skirts." The video was obviously cut and twisted to make her look arrogant and dismissive. The voiceover, disguised but familiar, made my blood run cold. It was Curtis again. This wasn't just a tantrum anymore. It was harassment. We reached out to a lawyer, one of my former colleagues, and within 48 hours, sent a legal takedown request to the platform and a cease and desist to Curtis, along with a harassment complaint. We weren't going to let this spiral any further. But Curtis? He had one more card to play. That weekend, Natalie received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, long, emotional. A love letter masked as manipulation. He reminisced about their first date, their nights together, his father's hospital stay. But the last line chilled us both. "If you walk away, I don't know what I'll do." It wasn't love. It was a threat wrapped in nostalgia. We went straight to the courthouse and filed for a restraining order. Natalie sat in the hallway, letter in her hand, her body trembling. "I know this is right," she whispered, But why does it still hurt so much? I put my arm around her and said the only thing I could. You're not tired. You're healing. And healing isn't painless. Curtis was served within days. He was officially prohibited from contacting or approaching Natalie in any way. For the first time in months, we felt a shift. Not just distance from the chaos, but control over it. Natalie returned to work, focused, energized. She didn't let fear dictate her choices anymore. Instead of shrinking back, she moved forward confidently. Her smile came back. Her laugh felt lighter. Curtis had lost access to her world. And maybe, just maybe, he realized he never truly belonged there in the first place. Have you ever had to take legal action just to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments below. The following week passed quietly, almost deceptively so. Natalie threw herself into her work, her routines, and focused on rebuilding her peace. She was no longer checking her phone obsessively, no longer jumping at every notification. But just when we thought we had finally closed that chapter, Curtis came crawling back, not with apologies, but with something worse. One evening, after a long day at work, Natalie returned home holding a small box. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes betrayed a heavy weight. "This came to my office," she said simply, placing it on the kitchen table. Inside was a letter handwritten, shaky, almost desperate, and a flash drive. Curtis's handwriting was instantly recognizable. The note rambled, a mess of self-pity and tangled emotions, full of memories, regrets, and desperate pleas. He described their first date, how she used to laugh with her whole body, how her presence calmed him. At first, it almost sounded like a genuine attempt at closure, but toward the end, the tone shifted. "If you don't respond, I don't know what I'll do. I can't take the silence anymore. I can't lose you not like this." Natalie sat down slowly, folding the letter. Her hands were trembling. "It's not an apology," she said flatly. "It's a warning." I agreed. That night, I made a phone call I had hoped never to make. A former classmate of mine, now a senior attorney at a respected firm, took the case without hesitation. The next morning, a formal cease and desist letter was issued, demanding Curtis stop all direct and indirect contact. We also filed for a restraining order and began preparing to report civil harassment. But Curtis didn't stop. A few days later, Natalie's inbox lit up with an anonymous tip. A social media account, clearly fake, had posted photos of her taken during their relationship, paired with twisted captions and comments painting her as manipulative, money-hungry, and cold-hearted. The photos were selectively cropped and edited to fit a cruel narrative. They weren't pornographic, but they were deeply personal, violating. "She's a gold digger who used me and then dumped me the moment she got what she wanted." The post gained traction fast, especially in the local business circles, where Natalie's name was becoming increasingly well known. She was devastated. "They're mocking my career, my reputation, everything I worked for," she whispered, scrolling through the comments. But this time there were no tears, only silence, then anger. I reached out again to our legal contact. Within 24 hours, we issued a takedown request and tracked the IP address behind the anonymous account. While it didn't officially confirm Curtis as the poster, everything lined up, enough for legal escalation. Natalie quietly sat beside me that night and said, "This man isn't obsessed with me, he's obsessed with controlling the story." And she was right. A few days later, a new envelope arrived this time. No letter, just a small velvet box. Inside was the engagement ring Natalie had purchased herself months ago. No note, no return address, just silence. It was the cruelest twist of all, a silent mockery, a way to say, "I know you paid for this, and I still win." Natalie stared at the ring for a long moment, then closed the box and stood up. "I want to sell it," she said quietly. Every trace of him gone, and she did. The following week, she donated the proceeds to a domestic abuse support charity. A quiet act of closure, a reclaiming of power. Yet Curtis was still lurking this time in whispers. Rumors began spreading in her workplace that Natalie had slept her way into industry connections, that her promotions weren't earned but bought, that her reputation came with a price tag. This was no longer petty revenge, it was targeted sabotage. Our lawyer advised us to gather evidence, document every incident, and prepare for the worst. But we didn't wait. Natalie and I went straight to HR. With calm but firm resolve, she laid out the full timeline, backed with emails, screenshots, and documents. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply presented the truth. The head of HR leaned back, quiet for a long moment, and said, "We will not tolerate this. Thank you for bringing it to us." The next day, an internal investigation was launched. 3 employees had been spreading the rumors based on conversations they had with Curtis outside of work. None of it had come from within the company, but Natalie's name had still been dragged through the mud. Those employees were formally reprimanded, and Curtis was issued a cease communication order through his former HR contact, which was now a legal file. But Natalie had had enough. "I don't want to be afraid to succeed anymore," she told me that night. "I want my wins to be mine again." So she doubled down on her work. She began leading projects with authority, walking into boardrooms with quiet confidence, speaking on stages without fear. And slowly, very slowly, the tide shifted. People started seeing her again. Not the rumors, not the drama, just her. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Natalie was invited to speak at a National Women in Leadership conference. It was a big deal. Dozens of Fortune 500 reps, top-level executives, and even media coverage. And she said yes. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She stood on that stage, under the spotlight, and told her story, not about Curtis, but about resilience, boundaries, and reclaiming your identity in the face of pressure and betrayal. And she received a standing ovation. It was the loudest silence she had ever heard, the kind that didn't come with shouting or confrontation, but with respect. When she walked off that stage, she was a different woman than the one who had once whispered, "I just want to be loved." She no longer needed Curtis to validate her worth. She had found her voice. Later that evening, as we walked back to the hotel, I asked her, "Do you feel lighter now?" She smiled. "I feel seen. And sometimes that's all we really want. To be seen for who we are without the noise, without the lies." But the story wasn't quite over yet. Life began to feel calm again, like the sea after a storm. Natalie was smiling more, laughing freely, and getting her rhythm back. It felt like we could finally breathe. But as life often teaches us, peace doesn't mean the past disappears. One afternoon, as Natalie and I were enjoying coffee by the kitchen window, her phone buzzed. The notification read, "Unknown number." She hesitated, then opened the message. It was from Curtis. A simple sentence. I saw the article. "So you really moved on." There was no anger in the message, no threats, just a hollow weight, heavy with implication. But we both knew that silence from Curtis never meant peace. It meant he was watching, calculating. That same night, Natalie received another email, this time, not from Curtis, but from a journalist. The subject line read, "Seeking comment for feature story." The body of the email explained that a tip had been submitted, suggesting Natalie was involved in financial manipulation during a past relationship. The journalist made it clear they hadn't run the story yet, but were giving her a chance to respond. Natalie looked stunned. "He's trying to drag this into the public," she whispered. Curtis had crossed yet another line. No longer content with private sabotage, he now wanted to tarnish her publicly. But what he underestimated again was that Natalie was no longer the woman who stayed silent to keep the peace. Our lawyer contacted the journalist and provided a detailed account, including legal documentation, restraining orders, and proof of defamation attempts. The story was never published. The journalist apologized, but the damage, the exhaustion remained. That weekend, Natalie packed a small overnight bag and drove out to the lake house we had rented years ago when she was a teenager. It had been a quiet place for reflection then, and now it would be again. She returned 3 days later with a new look in her eyes, calmer, firmer. "I'm not running anymore," she said. "I want to close this. Officially." So we did. We filed a civil lawsuit against Curtis for defamation, emotional distress, and violation of the restraining order. It wasn't about revenge. It was about drawing a boundary so deep it couldn't be crossed again. In the weeks that followed, we gathered every shred of evidence: emails, messages, social media activity, copies of the fake account's posts, witness statements, even receipts for the ridiculous invoice he once sent. And when the court date arrived, Natalie stood before the judge with the same composure she had shown on that leadership stage. Curtis, on the other hand, looked like a shell of who he used to be, unkempt, nervous, his usual arrogance replaced by fear. The judge didn't take long. Restraining order extended permanently. Damages awarded. Public record sealed in Natalie's favor. It was over. Outside the courthouse, Natalie exhaled like she was finally letting go of a weight she'd carried for far too long. "I thought I'd feel angry," she said quietly, "but all I feel is done." We hugged, not because we won, but because we endured. The following month, Natalie received a job offer from a prominent consulting firm. The same industry that had once whispered behind her back now welcomed her with open arms. Her reputation had not only survived, it had flourished. She turned the offer down. "I'm building my own," she said. "Something that's mine, from the ground up." With the help of a few trusted colleagues, Natalie launched her own consulting agency. It focused on helping women navigate toxic work environments and rebuild their confidence. The response was overwhelming. Clients poured in, media requests followed, speaking engagements were booked. Curtis faded into a shadow. His social accounts went silent. Word had it he moved to another city, changed industries entirely, but Natalie never looked him up. She didn't need to. One afternoon, as we were cleaning the garage, Natalie found an old box of photographs, snapshots from her college days. One picture in particular caught her attention. Her and Curtis at a street fair, both smiling. She stared at it for a moment, then turned to me. "I don't regret loving him," she said. "I regret thinking I had to lose myself to keep him." She tore the photo gently down the middle, not in anger, but with clarity. And just like that, another piece of him was gone. It was finally over. The dust had settled, the wounds had scabbed, and the storm that once threatened to tear everything apart had passed. But what remained was not wreckage, it was peace. It was a kind of silence that didn't hurt. For the first time in years, Natalie could wake up without bracing herself for another attack, another manipulation, another email from Curtis. Life, as they say, had moved on. Natalie threw herself fully into her career. She wasn't just recovering anymore. She was thriving. Her name began appearing in industry articles. She was invited to speak at panels, and clients respected not just her professionalism, but her unwavering clarity. When Granite and Company sent her to Tokyo for a week-long conference, she didn't hesitate. She spoke, she networked, and she came home with a contract that earned her team a promotion and a round of applause from corporate. There was no sign of Curtis anymore. Not online, not in the press, and certainly not anywhere near her life. The restraining order had worked not just legally, but emotionally. She had built a boundary that no one could cross again, especially him. On a warm spring morning, Natalie sat by the lake with me, sipping dark roast coffee, the scent of fresh grass and blooming wisteria wrapping around us like a soft shawl. Her eyes were brighter than they had been in years. "Mom," she said, watching the ducks glide across the water, "I think I finally understand what peace really feels like." I turned to her with a smile. "It shows." She looked down at the rippling surface. "It's not loud. It doesn't feel like winning a war. It's knowing you're no longer in one." The past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined her. Weeks later, Natalie received an invitation. Ethan's parents were hosting a small charity gala, and Natalie's presence was requested. No pressure, no obligation, just an open door. She accepted. And as she arrived, in an elegant but simple dress, with her chin high and confidence radiating from every step, I knew something had shifted forever. Ethan was there, of course, steady, calm, and present as always. They mingled with guests, laughed without tension, and Natalie spoke with donors like she belonged in that world. Because she did. That night, as they walked out into the courtyard beneath a sky full of stars, Ethan paused beside her. "I'm not here to rescue you," he said gently. "You already did that yourself. But I'd be honored to walk beside you from here forward." Natalie didn't reply with words. She just took his hand. It wasn't about rushing into a new chapter to overwrite the old one. It was about finally realizing that she didn't need to prove her worth to anyone. Not Curtis, not his family, not even to herself. She already had. A few months passed, and Natalie finally decided it was time to sell the house, the one we had given her before her engagement. Not out of bitterness, but because it no longer held meaning. It had been the backdrop of a life she had outgrown. The house sold quickly, and she used the funds to buy a cozy 2-bedroom near the lake. That home didn't represent obligation. It was hers, chosen and earned on her own terms. We still visited often. We'd sit on her back patio, surrounded by hydrangeas and roses, and talk about everything and nothing. She was at peace. I was proud. And for the first time, the word proud didn't just come from what she'd accomplished. It came from watching her fight for herself and finally win. Curtis faded into the background like a bad dream you only half remember. Rumors swirled that he'd been denied multiple jobs due to the public HR complaint filed at his last position, that he'd moved in with a cousin, that he was now working part-time at a warehouse. But we never verified any of it, because we no longer needed to. Natalie never looked him up. She never scrolled through his socials or stalked him online. She never wondered if he'd changed. She didn't care. One rainy afternoon, she was going through old boxes in her closet when she found the dusty envelope, Curtis's invoice, the itemized list of coffees, dinners, and rides he claimed she owed him for. She stared at it for a long moment, then laughed. Not bitterly, just genuinely. She brought it out onto the porch, set it in a metal tin, and lit a match. As the flames danced and the paper curled into ash, she whispered, "You were never worth the receipt." Natalie had once believed that love meant self-sacrifice, that if she gave enough, endured enough, proved herself enough, someone would choose her. Now she understood. Real love didn't demand that you become smaller. It didn't mock your success or gaslight your kindness. Real love met you where you stood and stood with you. A year later, Natalie stood again, but this time on a stage. She had been selected to deliver the keynote at an international business summit. And as her voice echoed through the hall, clear and full of conviction, I sat in the audience with tears in my eyes. Not because of the applause, but because she no longer needed it. Has someone ever mistaken your kindness for weakness? How did you take your power back? At its heart, this story carries a powerful message about self-worth, boundaries, and the quiet strength of walking away. For many in the 65-plus generation, those who were taught to give endlessly, to stay silent for the sake of peace, and to bear hardship as a badge of honor, this tale is a poignant reminder that love without respect is not love at all. The mother in the story poured her entire life into her child, only to be discarded when she was no longer useful. But instead of crumbling, she chose dignity. Instead of bitterness, she chose clarity. And when she finally reclaimed her voice and her life, it wasn't with vengeance, but with grace. This is a reflection so many older viewers will feel deeply, the realization that we are allowed to stop giving when it costs us ourselves, that our kindness is not a debt others are entitled to collect, and that it is never too late to choose peace, even if it means walking alone. Sometimes, the greatest act of strength is not in holding on, but in finally letting go. And in doing so, we teach others how to treat us, and ourselves how to heal.